Hi, welcome to another podcast from Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. Today what I want to look at and have a brief conversation with you about, and this will be applicable to everybody, but if you're a counsellor or a therapist, probably more so. When counsellors start training, part of their training is normally in a placement, a place where they would work whilst training. And as a supervisor, I see an awful lot of counsellors who come brand new into their business and start looking at how they relate to the world, themselves, their colleagues, their clients. And sometimes that journey is interesting in a sense that the process of being a counsellor, the process of listening to somebody and not having that urge to save, as we call it, to provide answers, provide solutions, is a very hard one to kind of overcome. Because naturally we want to help, that's why we do what we do, and part of that wanting to help sometimes steps over into that solution-focused process. So when people come to me, we have conversations around what it's going to be like to be a counsellor in front of a client for the first time, and the nervousness about doing that, and about putting their skills that they're learning to the test and checking those things out in the room. When we start that journey of becoming a counsellor or a therapist, we naturally get asked a lot of questions of ourselves, of our belief systems, our ethical considerations, our judgments, our biases, and we have to analyse that an awful lot. We have to work out where we sit within that process, how we see the world, how we see other people. That's never an easy one to go through, because that self-reflection, that way that we look at ourselves and look at what we do and how we see the world, brings up all sorts of confusion, comparisons, conflict sometimes with how we have been told the world is. And when we look at that, when we start working with people and start identifying those balances, those biases, those judgmental processes that we naturally do as human beings, we all do that, then we have to rearrange our understanding of how we see the world. That is never easy, as I've said. Sometimes that can create real disturbances within relationships that we have, friendships that we have, families that we connect to. Because as we become more and more aware of how everybody else works their world, and that no world is wrong, unless it's abusive, obviously, then we have to change what we think the world looks like. So we have to then go through a process of becoming more acclimatized to different ideas, different thoughts, different structures, in all sorts of ways, to be fair. And depending on what clients we're working with, obviously it will depend on how we view that and how we work that. For example, if we were working with children and young people in placement, then that's going to be a different process for us, and could be more engaging with trying to help and save than maybe working with adults, for example. Because children and young people look at the world differently, quite naturally, and the very idea of a child growing up is begin to be given the world, to see the world through somebody else's instruction, eyes, thoughts, ideas. We're not born with the world, as I've said on previous podcasts. So that process of identifying the child and the child work, or the children and young people work, it brings us into stark contrast with our upbringing, our growing up process, and some of the things that we went through until we became able to modify that description of the world, if you like, from our parental figures or peers. And then we kind of move into a different process. So depending on what client group we're working with, it depends on how it might or might not affect us, quite naturally. But part of the process of building that idea of self, that change, that accommodating of other people's ideas, thoughts, belief systems. So we're not judgmental, we're not biased. It makes us analyse our own relationships, our own connections. Things that I would have laughed about 25 years ago is not things I'd laugh about now. I've changed my ideas of what is humour, what is fun. So if the comedy was about somebody else's misfortune or somebody else's gender or sexuality or race or cultural process, then that wouldn't necessarily be funny to me now. And because those things are changed, then who I connect with and what they say to me, as they probably remember the old me that used to laugh at some things that weren't appropriate necessarily, then they're not going to change necessarily. They're going to want the old me. And so as therapists, as counsellors grow through this experience of training and working, then it challenges those connections, challenges those ideas, and that could create conflict. It could create a process where people that connect to us, who want the old us, if you like, then they may not like this new us. They may feel threatened by it. They may feel uncomfortable with it, because we might challenge what their ideas of the world is, their biases, their judgments, their cultural differences, whatever that might be, because we feel we have to give another side to the story. We have to give another input of what we've learned or what we've understood. So when we create those processes, and certainly with any training I've delivered on counselling, I always say to people that there's a health warning with the work you're going to do. You know, if you don't want to change your world and your life and your relationships, then please don't get into this process. Don't start the process of becoming a counsellor, because it is a massively radical different process. So when people are looking at their placements and they're looking at the work they do, they will start off with a couple of hours a week, maybe 1 hour a week sometimes, and they will build on that. Because they want to get used to the idea of being a counsellor, used to whatever a counsellor does. A lot of people have a different idea of what counselling is. And no two people will ever tell you what the modality of counselling is. You know, there's so many different names for different ways of counselling. You know, person-centred, solution-focused, CBT. You know, there's a whole range of different variations of how we work that world. And a lot of clients definitely don't understand that unless they've researched it or they're part of our world of counselling and therapy. So when we're going through that process of trying to take that client on that journey, on that process of helping them to understand, clarify, make choices, changes in their world, whatever it is they come to us to do, then some of that process means that they will touch us. And their experiences might be very similar to what we have been through. And that can be very difficult for new people, certainly, because when somebody's exploring their world, we naturally walk alongside them in that world, in the room, literally. We don't judge, as I've said. We accept, and so we have to be there with them, and we call that empathy, being alongside the client, not sympathy. Sympathy is different to empathy, and if we're empathic, as all human beings or most human beings are, then we, to a lesser or greater degree, then we kind of like share that story, share that experience, share those emotions, those feelings that come through that. And if we've been through something similar in our world, in our life, then it might be that that touches us more deeply, which is usually a shock for new people that's coming into the business. And it is a business, obviously. That new person coming in if something touches them that is deep inside their world, which they may not fully consciously be aware of, and then we have a reaction. We call that in the room transference. So there's something between that message, that's life, that story, that process, those emotions and feelings that client is going through, that will touch us. And that can be a major shock first time round. It becomes easier as we work more and we get more used to understanding it, because it can feel like us. It can feel like not our client's world. It can feel like it's our world. And although the client's bringing it into our world, and it might be an experience we've been through, it is about the client, not us. And that can be a really hard process for new counsellors to understand, to get their head around, and to understand what it is and how it works. So when we're working as supervisors with new counsellors in placement, then part of our role is to support that counsellor, that therapist. It's also some kind of psychoeducational process to go alongside the college, university, the degree, whatever they're doing. But it's also to kind of make sense of that world that they are interacting with, and understand some of the things, the feelings, the emotions that they're going through. If there's a particular traumatic event in the counsellor's world that's similar to the client's, then sometimes they don't realise that they've been triggered. They don't realise that they've been affected by that. And that can produce kind of flashbacks. It can produce emotional turmoil after the client's left sometimes, because that awareness coming up and growing is a way of us trying to understand our world as well as the client's world sometimes. So when we're looking at becoming a counsellor, we need to sometimes preempt these kind of conversations with new counsellors as supervisors. We need to give them a flavour of these things, which may or may not occur. And they don't always occur. It's not every time that you're with a client these things will happen. But it can do. And, if we preempt that conversation, at least they're in a bit of a place to understand it a bit more before they have to experience it, I suppose. Everybody comes into counselling usually because they want to help. We have a need to be needed. I have a need to be needed. And so that work fulfills that need, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But in doing that, it creates a process of us developing and growing with the counsellor that's also being supervised. We never stop learning. People will bring things to me now, even after 25 years of doing the work, that I've not looked at, or I've looked at in a different way, and they bring things into that supervisory process, which kind of starts making me think differently. And some of the podcasts that I've done are around those things that I've thought, well, okay, let's have a look at this. So that process, that dialogue, is not just a learning process for the counsellor, the therapist. It's also a learning process for us as supervisors. And if there's any supervisors watching this, you will know what I'm talking about. That process of learning never stops, thankfully. In fact, if it did stop, I think I'd probably give it up, to be fair. So moving through that process of learning, that connection, and certainly if you've got a supervisor, that is a really close relationship, I've found, certainly with my supervisor, that you have to build an awful lot of trust in order to show your vulnerabilities, show your processes of not knowing, of errors, of situations, scenarios that might be uncomfortable to talk about, where you think you might have done something wrong, or you've not done it right, or those kind of things. Those way of being vulnerable. And I think the more we're the vulnerable person in that supervisor connection, then the more it's growing us, making us more sensitive, making us more aware. People will come into the first processes of having supervision with a placement, and they don't really know what that is, what it does, what you're supposed to do in the room. So part of our role is to provide that information. And I suppose in my world, because all supervisors are different and they do it differently, in my world it's a holistic process. It means that basically everything that counsellor, that therapist is part of the work. We don't turn ourselves off when we walk through the door into the counselling room. We come with it. And so if something's affecting us in our world and our lives, then it can actually affect the work that we do with the client. And sometimes we need to take a time out, a sabbatical, while we may be going through something in our own private world, because it's not easy to work with the client in that process. Say, for example, I was going through a process of loss with a family member, and then I think it would be probably not a good idea to work with a client going through loss of a family member, because it's so close, it's in the moment, it's now. And that process could lead us down to all sorts of awkward situations. One of the things we talk to counsellors, therapists about in supervision is about, asking the questions that you might not want to ask, finding those ideas, understanding those experiential processes from the clients that might be difficult, might be awkward. So when we're working with them, sometimes it's challenging those things. It's challenging the ideas. And that means that we grow with that conversation. We grow experientially, we grow with our understanding, we'll grow with our theory model that we might be using. And all those pieces make us into better counsellors, better therapists. Doesn't seem so at the time sometimes. Feels like it's the world's falling in on us. And I can't do this anymore. And we've all been there. Everybody's been there at some point in time. But I think the process of becoming a counsellor, becoming a therapist, if you're watching this and you're going through that placement process, try not to give yourself a hard time. Try not to think that you're not good enough. And I've done a podcast earlier on in the series about that, which you might want to look back on. Everybody that goes into that room, client or counsellor, are both experiencing something for the first time, even if the client's had counselling before. So they're not really expecting anything from you as the counsellor, as the therapist, apart from that you will listen to them, you will support them, hold them in that process of counselling. Sometimes we think we should be doing more. Sometimes we think we're not good enough. We've not provided enough. Sometimes clients leave the process of counselling and we'll look at it and we'll go, that must have been something we did or we didn't do. We take responsibility for it, which is not necessarily true. And I think for those kind of processes, those kind of experiences, if somebody leaves the counselling process, a client leaves the counselling process, then in my world, we've done a good job. Because in my world, our work is about enabling the client to have autonomy, to make choices, decisions for themselves. And if that choice and decision is to leave the counselling process, leave us as the counsellor, as the therapist, then we've done a good job. Whether they tell us that or not is immaterial in a sense. They've made a decision, they've took action, they've made their choice, which might not be palatable for us as counsellors and therapists. But if that's what we're trying to enable them to do, then we have to celebrate that. We have to say, well, actually, this was helpful. This got them where they wanted to be. And that process of change, that process of making those choices and decisions is part of the work we've done. So when you're on placement and you have this process that usually placements are freebies from our point of view, the clients don't pay or they pay very little. So the value of the work is always a possibility that they will detach, because then it's not necessarily financially a big deal. So their process of paying for the sessions, their process of being there with us, sometimes there's not an awful lot of financial investment. And that can change the dynamic. That can change how we work and how they see us. So sometimes the detachment is just because it's easier for them to detach, to take that choice, make that happen, than it is to stay within the counselling. And depending on what we're working with, depends on whether or not that is more of a possibility. For example, if you're working on something around sexual abuse or trauma in somebody's past, then likely as not they won't do that in one job lot. They will produce bits of work to enable them to come to terms with what they've found out, come to terms with what they're feeling. So they might have breaks, they might have time away from the counselling, and that's actually healthy for them. Now, that might not be a thought process. That might just, one day they might think this is too much, and they'll take a break. But the process of getting them to that point where they've made that choice is obviously healthy, because they're making a choice. But also then they may come back into counselling to do another piece of work after they've got used to or acclimatised to that process, that feelings, emotions that they've gone through, that awareness that they've got. Sometimes counsellors, therapists don't see it like that. So if people do disconnect from you, if people do take a break, don't automatically assume it's a negative process, because it quite literally usually isn't. It's a process of development. It's a process of becoming more able to cope. Now, sometimes that won't happen. Sometimes they'll do a piece of work, they'll finish, they'll end, and that'll be great. And sometimes you'll have an ending that's been programmed, an ending that's been constructed that you both agreed to. But sometimes you won't. But being the need to be needed kind of person, we usually take the responsibility for those detachments, for those people making choices and decisions, and we usually take it personally. We all do that. That's not something that's just for new counsellors. It still happens sometimes when you've been 20 years, 30 years down the line. Less so usually, but it can still affect us. So in working with that process, that understanding, try to reflect that that person has made a choice, made a decision, and that's a good thing. That's given them autonomy. That's meaning that they've made some kind of progress from when they first walked through the door with you. As you're growing through this process of counselling, and where it will lead, usually not many people know, then as you move forward and you get to the point where you've done your 100 hours or whatever the contractual process is with the placement with the educational provider, then you have to think, what do I do now? When I came across that, after I'd done my first year at Leeds on a person-centred course, and the tutor quite naturally came to all of us one at a time, said, okay, so where do you go from here? And he gave me a really good piece of advice, which stuck with me. 25 years later, I'm talking to you about it, so it obviously stuck with me. He said, whatever you do, Ian, don't do something that you're not interested in. Do something that you can connect to, you have some understanding, life experience, knowledge about, and something that will stimulate you. And I asked him why, being a rookie. And he said, because if you don't, you'll either get very bored and you won't be as connected to the work as you should be, or you won't be able to empathise with the person or persons you're working with. And I thought that was really good advice. And when we come out of training and we're looking at where the next step is, because usually it's not one thing, usually it's a progressional thing. So we look at where we want to be with it and what we want to do. And that made me think about and look at what it is I was looking to get from the work I did. What would I be interested in? So you need to have those kind of thoughts, ideas at some point at the near end of your training. So, okay, where do I use these skills and abilities? Where do I go now? You might think you need a bit more training in some other areas that you want to work in. So you might go forward and do some attachment work, or you might go forward and do some CBT work, or you might go forward and do some solution focus work, TA work, all these modalities that we talk about and we share. Then you may then find that progression hasn't ended with that piece of paper, as it didn't for me. And you grow and you develop and you become more able to understand what it is you feel you want to help people with. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing. We're helping people come to some ideas, some understanding, some change, some developmental process, some processing of where they are in their world to make something different. And that process for me was looking at, okay, I didn't necessarily wanting to go into addiction work, for example. I don't think I could work within addictions specifically. I do work around addictions nowadays, but I don't work specifically in addictions, and certainly not with any 12-step program kind of process. So I thought, well, okay, what can I do? And I thought, right, okay, I've just been through a divorce from my relationship, and I would like to, and I'm interested in processing why that happened, why we got to the end of that relationship. What was it about that relationship that didn't work? And that was something that was interesting me. So I thought, okay, so where can I get that? And that's the hard bit when you're in the end of a placement. Where do I go next? What do I do? So as with all things, I think sometimes the universe provides, and the universe did provide, and I got an opportunity to train as a couple therapist with Relate, which is a national umbrella organisation. And they took me down that path, that avenue of working with couples, which I found very stimulating, exciting, scary, if anybody does couple work. You never know where you are, and you're flying by the seat of your pants sometimes, because you've always got conflict in the room, which you won't have with an individual necessarily. You might have conflict that's happening to them, but the conflict won't be in front of you usually, unless they're in conflict with you as a therapist, as a counsellor. And so I kind of went down that avenue, and I'm glad I did. I'm glad I got that advice at the end of that first year from the tutor, and that process of developing me, developing what I did. And then the next 3 to 4 years, I honed that skill, that niche, if you like, which isn't right for everybody. Just the same as any therapy is not right for everybody as a counsellor. Some things don't gel with us. CBT programs don't gel with me necessarily. I'll use them, or aspects of them, but I won't necessarily entrench myself in them. I like to be with the feelings, emotions, and not solutions necessarily. So for me, that journey was a start of a change my whole life, my whole world. Which is why, if I'm doing training of counsellors, therapists, I always give them the health warning that this is going to change you and your life and your world massively. So if you don't want that to change, then please don't walk through this door. People laugh at me when I say that to them at the beginning, usually. But within 3 or 4 months, they kind of get it. They kind of know what it is. People say that being a counsellor and a therapist is going to be the be all and end all, and some of the universities and the colleges and the training establishments don't give you a view of what that might look like after you've finished your placement, and they start talking about how everybody needs a therapist and those kind of things, which is not true necessarily. but we'll probably always be in demand, I would imagine, because life is life. Sometimes that's not easy to understand, and they need people like me, you, to kind of look at those things and clarify those things for them. But when we're looking at a role, a job, a career, if you like, then don't always assume that this is going to lead to a full-time job. A lot of people look at what we do and don't realise that I will say to my clients, I don't work more than 18 hours a week, and I don't. And they'll say, oh, that's part-time work. But they don't realise that for every hour I spend in front of a client, there's probably another hour being spent that week working with the process of what we're working with, looking at it, talking about it with a supervisor, reading up on it, finding out about stuff, educational stuff. So for every 1 hour I spend in front of a client, I'm probably spending about another hour doing the work. And which is why when we're in placements, we need to think about the process transition from whatever your career is before you start training into where you want to go with it. But don't automatically assume you're going to walk out that college after you've finished your placement or university and you're going to walk into a career. Those things don't usually happen as often as people might tell you. So just think about that transition from what you do in your day-to-day life into how you're going to be as a counsellor, as a therapist, and look at a transition over probably 2 to 3 years before you get to the point where you will be able to make some kind of living at it. Maybe not full-time, but some kind of living at it. And those things, as I say, the colleges, universities don't really have a conversation about. So when you're looking at supervision as a placement, then what I say to my supervisees is try and have an idea of what you want to get from supervision, what you want to get from this hour and a half with me. And have an agenda, have something that you want to talk about. Not always problems, not always things that aren't working, things that are working, things that you are happy with, something that you've celebrated with clients. And try and look at that process of what you want to get from it before you enter the room. That will be helpful for you because you're going to get your needs met. Be helpful for the supervisor also to have a process that they're going to help you with. They know what you want from them. Whereas if you don't have that, it might not necessarily be helpful. So walk with that process and talk with your supervisor on how that works and what you want to get from supervision, because you're paying for it. It's your space. So you should have an idea of what you want to get from it. Above all, enjoy the role you've got. Enjoy the work you do. Yes, it's working sometimes with people's grief and some people's horror stories of life. But we can still enjoy being there with them and helping them and being part of that journey. I only know that if you don't enjoy it, then pretty much it's not going to be the experience you want to have. It's going to be more drudgery. It's going to be more, do I have to go there again, kind of a process. As you're working with that, understand that you will change. Always, you will change. And your ideas, your understanding of the world will change quite naturally. And that process will help develop you, but it will challenge your relationships. So if you're in a relationship, and we all are in some cases, most of the time, even with family, friends, and not necessarily intimate relationships, then it's a good idea to have conversations with your partner or your people around you about how these changes are occurring, what you're doing now, so that they have a process that they can see that you've not gone from A to Z, and there's been an A, B, C, D, E, F in between. And that change won't be so dramatic then for them to cope with, understand. The most things that people say to me is, when they know I'm a counsellor, And don't tell them you're a counsellor if you go into social situations. Because if you do, chances are either people won't want to be anywhere near you, or they'll kind of corral you into a corner and give you all their problems and situation scenarios. So the social situation will feel like work. So don't tell people you're a counsellor necessarily. And I laugh at that because obviously, some people I do tell I'm a counsellor, I'm a therapist. But a lot of people I don't, because it's so much easier when you're not working to have a life outside of counselling. And if you're in training, if you're in placement, there's a lot of time you're going to spend thinking about, talking about, expressing counselling processes, life processes. So try and find something that you can do that just switches that off, something that kind of takes it away. And even if you're an experienced counsellor, try to do that, because walking out of a counselling room and into life, your life, not as the counsellor but as Ian, then you need some way of dividing that off. You need some way of closing that down, and some way that helps you to get back into the other part of your world in your life. Hopefully all that made sense. Please like and share the podcasts, as you don't know whether or not somebody else might get some information from it, and help yourself to help others. Make sure that you're not doing too much. Burnout is a real thing. It can come across as very quickly, although it's been building usually. So make sure you don't do too much. Make sure you're always constantly work-life balance process. And bear in mind that you need to possibly have sometimes your own therapy in order to deal with the things that clients bring that might trigger things in your world and your life. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Take care and enjoy.